Hello everyone, today I'm going to do a voiceover tutorial on how I created this horse's nose. I'm going to be talking about what materials I used and how I used them to draw realistically like this. I'm starting with the background, and I usually do backgrounds in two sort of stages. The first stage is using both Rembrandt soft pastels, which you can see here, and soft tools to create a base layer. In this stage, I'm just worried about getting the right color down and getting enough pastel down to create a smooth base layer. I'm working on Clairefontaine pastel matte paper, and this paper holds on to the pastel really well, which is a good thing, but it makes it hard to blend sometimes, so that's why you need enough pastel down in the beginning to blend it together. You can see the reference in the bottom left corner, and you can see the color, the background color I'm trying to match has some pink to it, so I'm adding all sorts of colors to try and get that color. Now you can see I'm using a soft tool. It's like a small sponge on a stick. It blends the pastel really well together, and it's a really great tool when you're trying to create backgrounds. The only downside is it kind of leaves direction marks. You can kind of see which way you blended the pastel, but you'll see how I work around that later. I'm using a mix of browns and grays to create this background color. The background in the reference photo isn't the original background. I actually went in Photoshop and created this mock-up because I knew roughly what I wanted. I do that for most of my wildlife pieces. These first few layers of the background are not going to look the best. It takes time to get enough layers down to get it to blend smoothly. So that's just what I'm doing here. It's also good to know that you don't have to keep a super crisp line between the background and your subject. It's okay if it overlaps a little bit. Sometimes I will go ahead and outline my subject if I start to lose where it meets the background, but it's okay to overlap it a bit. So now that I have the first few layers down in the background, I'm kind of moving on to phase 2, where instead of using the soft tool, I'll blend with my finger and I'll focus on smaller sections. Something that's super important is not having a halo effect around your subject. You want the background to look like it's actually behind the subject, even though in reality it's right next to it on the paper. And if you have either a dark or light line around your subject, it really ruins that effect. So you really don't want that. As I'm finishing up the background here, I'm just working in smaller and smaller sections, kind of refining the small details. I will work on the background throughout a piece as it goes on, usually a couple touch-ups here and there, but for the most part, this is pretty much done. I'm using glassine paper here, which allows my hand to rest on the portrait without smudging the background. I'm starting with the darkest part of the nose and then going on to build up the base layer using the pastel pencils around that area. You could use the pastel sticks for this, but since this piece is so small, I'm using the pastel pencils because I have a bit more control. As I'm building up these base layers, I'm blending all the colors together with my finger, and this ensures that every inch of the paper gets covered and there are no gaps where one color meets the other. If there are small gaps, it can be hard to fill those in later, especially if it's after you put on your final layer of detail. So it's really convenient to just get rid of all those gaps in the base layer. The reference photo has this really beautiful rim light on one side of the horse, so that's what I'm doing there. I'm just continuing to build up my layers. I have a lot of browns, pinks, and grays going on in this piece. I'm working with two brands of pastel pencils, the Carbothello and the Faber-Castell. The Carbothello is much softer, so it builds up a base layer much quicker, which is very convenient in this stage. So I like to use those more if I have the right colors, but I do use a mix of both. It's also important to get your values right in this base layer because the top layers aren't going to change it drastically, so you want to get them as close as possible in the first few layers. So now that I've got my base layer pretty much done, I go in with all of my details right on top. The most important thing to note here is to get the fur direction right. This part of the nose doesn't have super complicated fur direction, but when I am drawing a subject that has fur going in all different directions, I'll usually start with a darker color and kind of outline the direction of the fur and then build up my layers from there. Another little tip is if you're working with pastels, you don't need to have your pencil sharp all the time. It definitely helps when you're doing very small hairs, but for most of it, just the regular pastel pencils will work just fine. And it definitely takes a lot of time to sharpen them, so it can sometimes be more trouble than it's worth. For this next section on the mouth, this is my first time doing this detailed of a horse's mouth, so I wasn't sure how to go about it. So I just started with all the darkest shapes that I saw before going on with the midtones and blending it all together. I also used a lot of artistic license. The nose here is very bumpy, and I copied that texture, but not a one-for-one copy from the reference photo, because there's so many small bumps, it was just too much work to do that. But if you have the right texture, even if the bumps are different than the reference photo, it will still look realistic because that's the right texture. Now that I have a base layer of gray, I'm going in with a black pastel pencil and creating even more dark lines that match the texture of the reference photo. And then I'm adding some lighter grays and even a bit of pink. It's about this point that I actually get kind of frustrated with this part of the mouth, so I actually save it for later, which is something I do a lot. If one section isn't working, I just move to another, and I'll come back to it when I am ready. This is also helpful because sometimes a section will only look good in the context of the rest of the piece, so until you have the rest of the piece in, it just looks off. So it's always good to move ahead when you need. I'm moving on to the bridge of the nose, kind of higher up. And this section has a lot more hair than the lower part of the nose. So it's a lot more like my usual workflow when I'm drawing dogs or lions or something. And there's pretty much 3 steps. There's the base layer, which I'm doing here. You just mix as many colors as you need and blend it all out really well. I usually just blend with my finger because the soft tool moves the pastel around way too much for what you want. You don't want it to all become one color, you just want it to blend together nicely. The second step is outlining the direction of the fur with a dark pastel pencil. In this case, I'm using black, but sometimes when the fur is lighter, a dark brown will do just fine. And it's really important to get this direction right, so if you think you've messed up at any point, just blend it out and try again. The third step is to add layers of hair on top of your first layer, roughly working dark to light, which is what I'm doing here, but I kind of skip ahead and I start doing the second step, which is outlining the fur direction on the lower section of this part, which in this case is lighter than the top part, so I'm just using a dark brown as my darkest color. Once that is all outlined, I just keep adding more layers. I included some real-time clips just so you can see how fast I'm actually adding these hairs. This horse had a few small scars on its nose. You could take those out if you wanted. I thought it added some interest, so I decided to keep those in. And once that's complete, I move on to the final section, which follows the same process as the previous one. I'm building up my base layers, and again, you could use pastel sticks for this. I'm using the pencils because this paper is quite small, and I'm blending out the base layer very well. I also do small sections on the mouth here and there, that section that I left earlier. And I'm moving on to outlining the fur direction for this section. I'm using a dark brown because this section isn't quite dark enough to use black. I switched up the camera a bit so I could see where I was working better. And I'm actually skipping ahead to the whiskers. I usually save those for the end, but I think I was getting a little impatient, so I just went ahead and did them now. They're not very complicated, they're just small lines. They can be scary sometimes, but they're not super hard. And this is all just more of the same. I'm just working dark to light with the hair in this section. And I actually saved that mouth for the very last, so I'm just finishing that up here, adding more contrast. And that is essentially it. I really just kind of go around adding a few hairs here and there. But that is my tutorial for how I created this horse nose. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and maybe even consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.